The morning of June 19th, 1944, Admiral Ozawa stood on the bridge of the carrier Taiho, flagship of the Japanese mobile fleet, watching his pilots man their aircraft. Around him, 9 carriers prepared to launch the largest carrier strike since Midway. 473 aircraft, the American task force, had been located. This would be the decisive battle Japan had been preparing for. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But something was wrong. The intelligence reports that morning had mentioned American carriers. Ozawa expected perhaps 6, maybe 8, if the Americans had scraped together every available ship. What his scout planes reported back made him read the message 3 times. 15 carriers, 15 fleet and light carriers, operating together, launching aircraft in numbers that seemed impossible. Ozawa had commanded carriers since Pearl Harbor. He knew what a carrier task force looked like. 6 carriers was a massive concentration of force. 8 would be unprecedented. But 15. The Americans had lost 4 carriers at Midway alone. They had lost Lexington at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Wasp and Hornet in the Solomons. Where had 15 carriers come from? The answer lay not in the Pacific, but in the shipyards of the eastern United States, in places Ozawa had never seen. Newport News, Virginia, Quincy, Massachusetts, Brooklyn, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Norfolk, Virginia. 5 shipyards, operating around the clock, producing carriers at a rate that Japanese naval intelligence had calculated was impossible. This is the story of how American industrial capacity didn't just win the carrier war in the Pacific. It made the carrier war unwinnable for Japan from the moment it began, because while Japan struggled to build 3 carriers during the entire war, America launched 24 fleet carriers of a single class, the Essex-class, and Japan never saw it coming. To understand how completely Japan miscalculated, you have to go back to 1941, to the months before Pearl Harbor, when the Imperial Japanese Navy was planning for war. The naval staff knew they would be facing the United States. They knew America had industrial capacity. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known without seeing it firsthand, was the scale of that capacity. Japan began the Pacific War with 10 carriers, 6 fleet carriers, and 4 light carriers. The fleet carriers were the pride of the combined fleet. Akagi and Kaga, converted from battleship and battlecruiser hulls, Soryu and Hiryu, purpose-built fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, the newest and most capable carriers in the world when they were commissioned in 1941. The Japanese carriers were excellent ships. Shokaku and Zuikaku could carry 72 aircraft, more than any American carrier at the time. They were fast, well-armed, and their crews were superbly trained. Japanese naval aviation in 1941 was the finest in the world. Pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time, crews that had trained together for years, tactics that had been refined through combat in China. The Americans had 7 carriers when the war began. Lexington and Saratoga, massive converted battlecruiser hulls commissioned in the late 1920s. Ranger, an experimental design from the early 1930s. Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, the modern fleet carriers, commissioned between 1937 and 1941. And Wasp, a smaller carrier built to use up remaining treaty tonnage. On paper, the numbers looked almost even. 10 Japanese carriers versus 7 American. And after Pearl Harbor, with 3 American battleships at the bottom of the harbor, the numbers tilted in Japan's favor. 6 American carriers, operational in the Pacific, versus 10 Japanese. Japan had the numerical advantage, the better trained pilots, the more experienced carrier commanders. What the Japanese naval staff didn't account for, what they couldn't see from Tokyo, was what was already under construction in American shipyards. On July 3rd, 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had ordered 3 carriers from Newport News Shipbuilding. not conversions, not light carriers built on cruiser hulls, purpose-built fleet carriers designed without treaty restrictions for the first time since the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. The lead ship was designated CV-9. She would be named Essex. Her keel was laid on April 28, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. By December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, 5 Essex-class carriers were already under construction. 5. Japan's entire wartime carrier construction program would struggle to build 4 new fleet carriers from keel to commissioning. But in December 1941, this information wasn't available to Japanese intelligence. The carriers were being built on the East Coast, 3,000 miles from the Pacific. The shipyards were civilian facilities, not closely guarded naval bases, but they operated with a level of security that kept their production numbers hidden. What Japan knew was that America had shipbuilding capacity. What they didn't know was how that capacity would be applied. The Japanese Naval General Staff had calculated American carrier construction times based on pre-war experience. The Yorktown-class carriers had taken between 3 and 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. Yorktown herself had been laid down in May 1934 and commissioned in September 1937. 3 years and 4 months. Enterprise, laid down in July 1934, commissioned in May 1938. 3 years and 10 months. If American carriers took 3 to 4 years to build, then any carrier construction started after Pearl Harbor wouldn't be ready until 1945 at the earliest. The war would be decided long before then. Japan had 6 months, perhaps a year, to establish a defensive perimeter so strong that America would negotiate rather than fight through it. Time was on Japan's side, except time wasn't on Japan's side, because American shipyards in wartime didn't work the way Japanese planners expected. USS Essex, the lead ship of her class, was laid down in April 1941. She was commissioned on December 31st, 1942. 20 months, less than 2 years. American shipbuilders had cut carrier construction time in half, and Essex wasn't an anomaly. She was the prototype for a production system that would operate at a scale Japan couldn't match. Yorktown, CV-10, laid down in December 1941, commissioned in April 1943. 16 months. Intrepid, laid down in December 1941, commissioned in August 1943. 20 months. Hornet, laid down in August 1942, commissioned in November 1943. 15 months. The Essex-class carriers were being built faster than Japan could sink them, and there were so many of them under construction that even if Japan had sunk one every month, America would still have gained carriers. By September 1942, 3 months after Midway, 6 Essex-class carriers were in various stages of construction. By the end of 1942, 10 were under construction. This was information that Japanese intelligence tried to track. Submarine commanders reported unusual activity at East Coast shipyards. Spotty reconnaissance from long-range flying boats occasionally photographed American naval facilities. The intelligence analysts in Tokyo compiled the reports and tried to make sense of them. The numbers didn't add up. The Americans couldn't be building that many carriers. It was impossible. But the Americans weren't just building Essex-class fleet carriers. In early 1942, as losses mounted in the Coral Sea and at Midway, the Navy realized that even with the Essex-class in production, there would be a gap. The first Essex wouldn't commission until late 1942. The second wouldn't arrive until early 1943. In the meantime, America needed carriers immediately. The solution was the Independence-class, light carriers built on Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls. 9 cruisers already under construction were pulled from the production line and converted. The conversions were fast. Independence, laid down as a cruiser in May 1941, was converted to a carrier configuration and commissioned in January 1943. 8 months from conversion decision to commissioning. Princeton, commissioned in February 1943. Belleau Wood in March. The Independence-class carriers arrived at almost 1 per month through 1943. The Independence-class weren't fleet carriers. They were smaller, carried fewer aircraft, weren't as capable in heavy seas, but they were carriers, and they were available. And they filled the gap until the Essex-class arrived in numbers. Japan had no equivalent program. When Japan lost carriers, those carriers were gone. There was no rapid construction program to replace them. There was no industrial capacity to convert other ships. There was just loss. Midway had been the turning point. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk in a single day. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Half of Japan's fleet carrier force gone. The Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, raided into the Indian Ocean, had been gutted. Japan would never recover from Midway, not because the ships couldn't be replaced, but because the pilots couldn't, and because, while Japan tried to replace 4 carriers, America was building 24. After Midway, the Japanese naval staff convened to assess carrier strength and plan future construction. Japan still had Shokaku and Zuikaku, the 2 fleet carriers of the 1st Carrier Division. Both had been damaged at Coral Sea, but were being repaired. Japan also had Junyo and Hio, 2 carriers converted from passenger liner hulls and several light carriers converted from other ships. The situation wasn't hopeless. If new carriers could be built quickly, if the Americans could be held at a distance, Japan could rebuild. The problem was industrial capacity. Japan's shipbuilding industry in 1942 was already stretched thin. Building destroyers to protect convoys, building submarines for offensive operations, building transports to supply the newly conquered territories, building tankers to bring oil from the Dutch East Indies, and now building carriers to replace the losses at Midway. The carrier construction program that emerged from the post-Midway planning sessions was ambitious. The Modified Fleet Replenishment Program of 1942 called for a new generation of carriers. Taiho would be the first, an armored fleet carrier designed to be the flagship of the rebuilt carrier force. She would be followed by 5 more carriers of an improved Taiho design, heavily armored ships that could absorb damage and keep fighting. For second-line duties, Japan would build the Unryu-class, carriers based on the older Hiryu design. They would be simpler, cheaper, faster to build than Taiho. The plan called for 16 Unryu-class carriers, 16 carriers, to overwhelm the Americans with numbers, to replace the losses at Midway, and provide enough hulls for a decisive battle. It was a plan built on assumptions that were already obsolete. The assumption that Japan could build carriers faster than America. The assumption that American carrier construction would continue at pre-war pace. The assumption that time was available, that the war would last long enough for Japan to build its fleet. Every assumption was wrong. Taiho was laid down in July 1941, before Pearl Harbor. She was the only fleet carrier Japan would lay down in 1941. She was launched in April 1943. She was commissioned in March 1944, 32 months from keel laying to commissioning. American Essex-class carriers were being commissioned in 20 months or less, but Taiho's construction time wasn't just a matter of efficiency, it was a matter of resources. Japan didn't have enough steel. The steel mills couldn't produce enough to build carriers and destroyers and transports and submarines simultaneously. Priorities shifted constantly. Carriers were delayed while destroyers were rushed through. Then destroyer construction slowed to focus on carriers. Nothing moved smoothly. Japan didn't have enough workers. The shipyards employed skilled craftsmen, but there weren't enough of them. Training new workers took time, and the workers Japan did have were being drafted into the army. Shipyard managers fought with army recruiters over manpower. The army usually won. Ships sat partially completed while the workers who knew how to finish them marched off to New Guinea or Burma. Japan didn't have enough engines. This was the most critical shortage. Marine steam turbines required precision manufacturing. The factories that built turbines couldn't keep up with demand. The Unryu-class carriers were supposed to use turbines designed for the Mogami-class heavy cruisers, but there weren't enough Mogami-class turbines available. Some of the Unryu-class carriers had to use destroyer turbines instead. Destroyer turbines in fleet carriers. The ships lost a third of their planned power. Their top speed dropped by 2 knots. The United States had none of these problems. American steel production in 1942 was 10 times Japanese production. American shipyards could build as many carriers as the Navy ordered without affecting destroyer or submarine construction. American workers were plentiful, and when more workers were needed, training programs created them in weeks. American engine manufacturers produced turbines so reliably that Essex-class carriers all used the same standardized power plant. No substitutions, no delays, waiting for engines. By late 1942, intelligence reports reaching Tokyo confirmed what the most pessimistic Japanese planners had feared. The Americans were commissioning new carriers, not 1 or 2, many. Essex in December 1942, Yorktown in April 1943, Lexington in February 1943, Bunker Hill in May, Intrepid in August. The reports came month after month, each one another carrier joining the Pacific Fleet. Japanese naval officers read the reports and tried to understand what they meant. 1 new carrier per month. That couldn't be sustained. The Americans must be rushing ships through, commissioning them before they were fully ready. They would break down, require extensive repairs. The quality would be poor. Japanese carriers were built to exacting standards. American carriers, built so quickly, couldn't possibly match that quality. But the American carriers didn't break down. They operated continuously, launching strikes day after day. They took damage and kept fighting. USS Franklin would be hit by bombs in October 1944 that killed 56 men and started massive fires. She was repaired and returned to service. In March 1945, she would be hit again by 2 bombs that penetrated to her hangar deck and detonated among fully fueled aircraft. 724 men died. Franklin burned for hours. Her captain was given permission to abandon ship. He refused. Franklin survived and made it back to port under her own power. No Japanese carrier could have survived that level of damage. Japanese carriers were lighter, built with less armor protection to maximize aircraft capacity. When Japanese carriers were hit, they burned quickly. The enclosed hangars trapped fires. The fuel systems weren't protected. Damage control wasn't as effective because crews were smaller, training less comprehensive. Taiho, Japan's newest and most heavily armored carrier, was sunk in June 1944 by a single torpedo. 1 torpedo hit. She went down with nearly all hands. But in 1942 and early 1943, these facts weren't yet clear. What was clear to Japanese planners was that they were losing the numbers game. Ozawa's report after the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would make it undeniable. His 9 carriers had faced 15 American carriers, and the Americans had more in reserve. The Unryu-class construction program revealed the depth of Japan's industrial crisis. 16 carriers had been planned. 16 seemed achievable. If construction could be streamlined, if resources could be allocated properly, if the Americans could be held at a distance long enough for the ships to be completed. The first 3 Unryu-class carriers were laid down in 1942. Unryu herself in August, Amagi in October, Katsuragi in December. The construction schedule called for these carriers to be completed in 18 months. Fast construction, faster than Japan had ever built fleet carriers before, but still slower than the Americans were building Essex-class carriers. And 18 months assumed everything went according to plan. Nothing went according to plan. Material shortages hit first. The steel allocated for carrier construction kept being diverted to other projects. A convoy had been sunk by American submarines. Replacing the lost merchantman took priority. Steel that should have gone to Katsuragi went to transport construction instead. Work stopped for 3 weeks while the Navy fought with the Army over steel allocation. The Army needed steel for tanks. The Navy needed steel for carriers. The argument went up to the highest levels of government. By the time it was resolved, another month had been lost. Then came the labor shortages. Skilled welders were drafted into the Army. The shipyard managers protested. These men were essential for carrier construction. The army didn't care. Japan needed infantry more than it needed carriers. Half-trained replacements were brought in. Work quality suffered. Welds had to be redone. Construction timelines slipped further. The engine problem proved catastrophic. The Megami-class cruiser turbines weren't available in sufficient numbers. Katsuragi and Aso, the third and fifth Unryu-class carriers, received destroyer turbines instead. Destroyer turbines in a fleet carrier. It was an admission of defeat disguised as adaptation. These carriers would be slower, less capable, unable to keep up with the fleet during high-speed operations, but they would float, and in 1943, floating was better than nothing. Construction dragged on. 18 months became 24 months. 24 became 30. Unryu was finally commissioned in August 1944, 3 years after her keel was laid. During those 3 years, America had commissioned 14 Essex-class carriers, 14 to Japan's 1. Amagi was commissioned in August 1944, 10 days after Unryu. Katsuragi followed in October, 3 Unryu-class carriers. Total wartime carrier construction for the Japanese Navy, Taiho, and 3 Unryu-class vessels. 4 fleet carriers, built from keel up during the entire war. America had built 17 Essex-class carriers by August 1945, 17 of a single class, more than 4 times Japan's entire wartime construction. But even those numbers didn't tell the full story, because the 3 Unryu-class carriers that were commissioned never saw combat. There were no aircraft to put on them. There were no pilots to fly those aircraft. There was no fuel to operate them, even if aircraft and pilots had existed. Unryu, Amagi, and Katsuragi were commissioned and then sat in port, beautiful ships with empty flight decks, monuments to industrial capacity that Japan no longer possessed. Unryu made 1 operational sortie. In December 1944, she was loaded with Oka rocket-propelled suicide weapons and sent to deliver them to Manila. She never arrived. On December 19th, the American submarine Redfish torpedoed her southeast of Shanghai. She sank in less than an hour. 1 operational sortie, 1 carrier lost. The other 2 Unryu-class carriers never left Japanese home waters. Compare that to the American experience. USS Essex, commissioned in December 1942, joined the Pacific Fleet in May 1943. She participated in the raid on Marcus Island in August, struck Wake Island in October, participated in the Gilbert Islands campaign in November, the Marshall Islands campaign in January 1944, the Truk raid in February, the Marianas campaign in June, the Philippines campaign in September, Iwo Jima in February 1945, Okinawa in March through May, the final raids on the Japanese home islands in July and August. 2 years of continuous combat operations, launching thousands of sorties. Her aircraft sank dozens of Japanese ships, destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft, supported amphibious landings from the Gilberts to Okinawa. Essex was 1 carrier. America had 17 more just like her, all operating continuously, all launching strikes, all contributing to the destruction of Japanese naval power. The industrial disparity wasn't just in numbers of carriers built, it was in everything that supported those carriers. The Americans could afford to keep 15 carriers operating together because they had the destroyers to screen them, the cruisers to provide anti-aircraft protection, the oilers to refuel them at sea, the logistics ships to keep them supplied with ammunition, food, spare parts, everything a carrier task force needed to operate thousands of miles from its home base. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Japan couldn't field 9 carriers together without stripping escorts from everywhere else. Even at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Ozawa's 9 carriers were protected by a screen that was barely adequate. When the Americans located the mobile fleet and launched their strikes, Japanese anti-aircraft fire was heavy but not overwhelming, not compared to what American task forces could put up. American carriers operated in groups protected by layers of destroyers and cruisers, all equipped with radar-directed anti-aircraft guns. The defensive firepower was immense, and even if Japan had been able to build more carriers, even if the Unryu-class program had somehow completed all 16 ships, there was still the pilot problem. Japanese pilot training before the war had been rigorous. Prospective naval aviators trained for years. Standards were extraordinarily high. Only the best made it through. The result was a corps of elite pilots, but there weren't many of them. When those pilots died, and they were dying in increasing numbers through 1942 and 1943, replacing them was nearly impossible. The training pipeline couldn't be expanded quickly. It took 2 years to train a pilot to pre-war standards. Japan didn't have 2 years, so standards were lowered. Training was shortened. Pilots graduated with 300 hours of flight time instead of 600, then with 200 hours, then with less than 100. By mid-1944, Japanese pilots going into combat had less training than American pilots had received in 1942. They were flying against American pilots who had been in combat for a year or more. Veterans who had learned tactics that worked, who had aircraft that were now equal to or better than Japanese fighters. The Zero had been the finest carrier fighter in the world in 1941. By 1944, the Hellcat and Corsair were faster, more rugged, better armed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated what happened when American industrial superiority met Japanese desperation. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers, 5 fleet carriers, and 4 light carriers. On paper, it was a powerful force, 473 aircraft, the largest carrier strike force Japan had assembled since Midway. The Americans had 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, 956 aircraft, more than twice what Ozawa could field. But numbers alone didn't tell the story. Ozawa's pilots were mostly inexperienced. Many had graduated from training just weeks before. They had minimal combat experience. Many had never made a carrier landing at sea. The American pilots were veterans. They had been flying combat missions for months, some for over a year. They knew their aircraft. They knew their tactics. They knew how to fight. The battle lasted 2 days. American radar detected the Japanese strikes at long range. Fighter directors positioned defensive patrols perfectly. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft were intercepted far from the American carriers. The slaughter was systematic. American Hellcats tore through Japanese formations, experienced pilots against novices, better aircraft against obsolete ones, superior tactics against desperation. By the end of the first day, Ozawa had lost 300 aircraft. 300. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The phrase captured the one-sided nature of the engagement. It wasn't a battle between equals. It was target practice. American pilots who had struggled against Japanese Zeros in 1942 were now shooting down poorly trained Japanese pilots in obsolete aircraft with almost casual efficiency. Ozawa's carriers survived the first day, but 3 were sunk during the battle. Taiho, hit by a single torpedo from the submarine Albacore, exploded and sank hours later. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier battle since, torpedoed by the submarine Kavala, went down with heavy loss of life. Hio, one of the converted passenger liners, sank after torpedo bomber attack. 3 carriers lost. The mobile fleet had been gutted. The Americans lost 1 light carrier and a handful of aircraft. They had more carriers in reserve, more pilots in training, more aircraft in production. The battle wasn't just a tactical defeat for Japan. It was proof that the carrier war was unwinnable. American industrial capacity had created a force so large that Japanese forces couldn't damage it significantly even when they achieved tactical surprise. After the Philippine Sea, Admiral Toyota Soemu, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, requested detailed assessments of American carrier strength. What came back was comprehensive and devastating. The Americans had commissioned 17 Essex-class fleet carriers. By mid-1944, they had 9 Independence-class light carriers operational, 26 carriers total Not counting the older Saratoga and Enterprise, which were still in service, Japan had 6 carriers operational after Philippine Sea. 6, and one of those, Zuikaku, was so short of aircraft and pilots that she could barely operate. The Americans had 26 carriers with full air groups, experienced pilots, and unlimited replacements. Japan had 6 carriers with partial air groups, inexperienced pilots, and no replacements available. The intelligence reports also detailed American carrier construction that was still ongoing. More Essex-class carriers were being commissioned every month. Hancock in April 1944, Ticonderoga in May, Randolph in October, Shangri-La in September. The Americans weren't slowing down, they were accelerating. By the end of 1944, the United States Navy would have more carriers in commission than Japan had built in its entire naval history. Toyota read the reports in his office in Tokyo. He was 59 years old enough to remember when Japan's navy had consisted of a handful of cruisers and destroyers. He had watched the combined fleet grow into a world-class force. He had commanded battleships and cruisers. He had seen Japanese naval power at its zenith in 1941. Now he was watching it die, not in battle, but in shipyards 3,000 miles away, where American workers built carriers faster than Japanese forces could sink them. The mathematics were simple and brutal. In 1943, American shipyards had commissioned 9 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 in 1 year, more fleet carriers than Japan had built in the previous decade, and that was just fleet carriers. The Americans were also building escort carriers using the same mass production techniques Henry Kaiser had pioneered for Liberty ships. Dozens of escort carriers, small carriers built on merchant hulls, launched faster than Japan could train pilots to oppose them. The escort carriers weren't as capable as fleet carriers. They were slower, carried fewer aircraft, couldn't take as much damage, but they provided air cover for convoys, supported amphibious landings, hunted submarines. They freed up the fleet carriers for offensive operations. Japan had no equivalent. Every Japanese carrier had to be a fleet carrier because Japan didn't have enough carriers for specialized roles. By late 1944, American carrier production had reached a pace that seemed designed to humiliate Japan. USS Antietam was laid down in March 1943, commissioned in January 1945. 22 months. USS Boxer, laid down in September 1943, commissioned in April 1945. 19 months. USS Bonhomme Richard, laid down in February 1943, commissioned in November 1944. 21 months. Consistent construction times, reliable delivery schedules, no delays for material shortages or labor disputes or engine availability. The American shipbuilding industry operated like a machine. Order a carrier, wait 20 months, receive a fully operational warship, complete with aircraft, pilots, fuel, ammunition, everything needed for combat operations. It was industrial warfare at a scale Japan simply couldn't comprehend. The remaining Japanese carriers after Philippine Sea were shadows of what they had been. Zuikaku, sole survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force still operational, had a partial air group of poorly trained pilots. She would be sunk at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the last of the 6 Pearl Harbor carriers to go down. Chitos and Chiyoda, light carriers, converted from seaplane tenders, were also sunk at Leyte. Junyo, one of the converted passenger liners, was torpedoed and spent the rest of the war under repair. By the end of 1944, Japan had no operational fleet carriers. None. If the combined fleet still had a few light carriers scattered in home waters, but they had no aircraft, no pilots, no fuel. They were floating hulks, incapable of combat operations. The carrier war was over. America had won not through superior tactics or better admirals, though both helped, but through industrial capacity that Japan could never match. The final Essex-class carriers to see combat in World War II arrived in the summer of 1945. USS Boxer, commissioned in April. USS Lake Champlain, commissioned in June. They joined the massive carrier task force that was systematically destroying what remained of Japanese naval and air power. By July 1945, American carriers were launching strikes against the Japanese home islands almost daily. Hundreds of aircraft, attacking factories, railroads, airfields, ports. There was no effective opposition. Japanese air defenses had been overwhelmed. The carrier task force, operating off Japan in the summer of 1945, numbered more than 20 carriers. 20 carriers operating together, launching coordinated strikes of hundreds of aircraft. It was the culmination of everything American industrial capacity had built toward. Not one carrier, not 5 carriers, 20 carriers, with more in reserve, with replacement aircraft arriving continuously, with fresh pilots rotating in to replace those lost in combat. Compare that to Japan's situation. Amagi and Katsuragi, the 2 surviving Unryu-class carriers, sat in Kure Harbor. They had never conducted combat operations. They would never conduct combat operations. In March 1945, Amagi was damaged by American carrier aircraft. In July, she was hit again and capsized in shallow water. Katsuragi was also damaged in the July raids. She survived the war, but never fired a shot in anger. Her existence was pointless. A carrier without aircraft or pilots or fuel was just a very expensive steel box. Shinano, Japan's largest carrier. The converted Yamato-class battleship hull had been commissioned in November 1944. She was the largest carrier ever built at that point, displacing 62,000 tons, larger than any American carrier. She made one voyage from Yokosuka to Kure to complete fitting out. On November 29th, 10 days after commissioning, she was torpedoed by the American submarine Archerfish. 4 torpedoes. Shinano sank, taking 1,400 men with her. The largest carrier ever built sunk on her first voyage, having never launched a single aircraft in combat. The final toll, was devastating. Japan had started the war with 10 carriers. Japan had built 4 new fleet carriers during the war. Taiho and 3 Unryu-class vessels. 1 additional carrier, Shinano, had been converted from a battleship hull. Total carriers built or converted during the war: 5. America had built 17 Essex-class fleet carriers during the same period, 17 of a single class, not counting the 9 Independence-class light carriers or the dozens of escort carriers. But the numerical disparity, as crushing as it was, didn't capture the full scope of American advantage. It wasn't just that America built more carriers, it was that American carriers operated continuously while Japanese carriers sat idle. It was that American carriers could take damage and return to service while Japanese carriers, when hit, usually sank. It was that American carriers had aircraft and pilots and fuel while Japanese carriers had empty decks. Admiral Ugaki Matome, who had served as Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet and survived the war, wrote in his diary in November 1944, after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, "We have lost the war. Not today, not at Leyte. We lost it at Midway. Or perhaps before that. Perhaps we lost it the moment Yamamoto's planes struck Pearl Harbor, because in that moment we committed ourselves to a fight we could not win against an opponent we did not understand." Ugaki understood what many Japanese officers had taken years to accept. The war had been lost before it began, lost in the industrial capacity that America possessed and Japan lacked, lost in the shipyards that could build carriers in 20 months instead of 32, lost in the steel mills and oil fields and training programs that provided everything a modern navy needed, lost in the ability to replace losses, to expand forces, to sustain operations indefinitely. The Essex-class carriers weren't just ships. They were proof of concept, proof that industrial warfare, when conducted at sufficient scale, made traditional military calculations obsolete. It didn't matter how skilled Japanese pilots were if America could train twice as many pilots. It didn't matter how well-designed Japanese carriers were if America could build 5 carriers in the time Japan built one. It didn't matter how determined Japanese forces were if determination couldn't overcome the simple mathematics of industrial production. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, 24 Essex-class carriers had been built, 17 had been commissioned in time to see combat, 7 more were commissioned shortly after the war ended. 24 carriers of a single class, the most numerous class of fleet carrier ever built. Not one was lost to enemy action during the war, though several took heavy damage. Franklin, Bunker Hill, Intrepid all survived hits that would have sunk Japanese carriers. They survived because they were built to survive, with armor protection, damage control systems, and construction standards that emphasized resilience over speed or elegance. Japan built 3 Unryu-class carriers. 3. One was sunk on her first operational voyage. The other 2 never conducted combat operations and survived the war as damaged hulks. The contrast was absolute. American industrial capacity had built a fleet of carriers that overwhelmed Japanese opposition through sheer numbers and continuous availability. Japanese industrial capacity had struggled to build 3 carriers that never significantly contributed to the war effort. In the decades after the war, historians and naval analysts would study the Pacific Carrier War extensively. They would analyze tactics, leadership, aircraft design, pilot training. All of those factors mattered. But beneath every analysis was a fundamental truth that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. America built 24 fleet carriers of the Essex-class, while Japan built 3 of the Unryu class, 24-3. The numbers told the entire story. Japanese admirals, after the war, were asked what they thought when they learned America was building carriers at such a pace. Admiral Ozawa, who had commanded the mobile fleet at Philippine Sea, said it simply: "We never had a chance. We were celebrating tactical victories while the Americans were building a fleet. By the time we understood what we were facing, the war was already lost." The Essex-class carriers would serve for decades after World War II. They were updated for jet aircraft. They fought in Korea and Vietnam. Some remained in service until the 1990s, 50 years after they were commissioned. They were adaptable, resilient, capable of evolution as carrier warfare evolved. They were built not just for the war they were fighting, but for the wars that would come after. The Unryu-class carriers were scrapped shortly after the war ended. They had been built for a war that Japan couldn't win, using resources Japan didn't have, to a standard Japan couldn't maintain. They represented Japan's attempt to match American production through force of will and determination. But will and determination couldn't forge steel that didn't exist, couldn't train workers who had been drafted into the infantry, couldn't build engines when the factories were being bombed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.